picks him up in a car, drives him off to the suburbs, or puts him up in a hotel. Now we have a federal investigation into the Atlanta Police Department. So what the federal investigation found was that this was rampant in Atlanta, that police were routinely lying on these search warrants, that there had been numerous wrong door drug raids, that the cover-ups, the lies, had infected the entire narcotics department at Atlanta PD. The reason for that was that Atlanta PD had imposed quotas on its narcotics officers. They had to arrest so many people for drug charges each month. They had to seize a minimum quantity of drugs each month. And of course, that's going to affect the way you do your job. Their performance reviews, their raises, their promotions were based on them meeting and exceeding these quotas. Well, let me back up a little bit. So the Atlanta City Council then has hearings. Dozens of people come forward to say, this happened to me too. I was also raided. In fact, there was an 88-year-old woman who lived 3 doors down from Katherine Johnson who had been raided 3 months earlier by the same narcotics team. She also had a toy gun she kept next to her bed to scare people off. They did manage to hold their fire in that case. What the federal investigation did not find, but what I can say based on my own research, is the reason why Atlanta PD had these quotas was the result of a number of federal policies. Over the years, federal government has made a number of drug-fighting grants available to police departments across the country. And all these police departments, your sheriff's department, your local PD, your state police, are all competing with one another for a slice of these grants. So there's enormous pressure on them to meet the requirements to get one of these grants. And the really perverse thing is that the way these grants are set up, they go to the areas where the police are making the most arrests. It has nothing to do with the areas where there's low crime, low drugs, nothing about the drug supply in a given community. It's about raw numbers. So if your city police department does a 6-month-long investigation and brings down, the kingpin who's supplying half the city with drugs, that's a 1 on their applications for one of these grants. They arrest 10, 13 to 16-year-old hoppers who are running drugs out on the streets to cars to sell them to people. How many did I say? 20? 10. That's 10 when they apply for the federal grant. So it's nothing to do with quality, it's all about quantity. So again, when you watch your police procedurals and they arrest the mid-level guy and they, pile charges on him and then they offer him a deal if he'll give up everybody above him, that's not really the way it works. In practice, they usually bust someone and cut him a deal to give up everyone underneath him because those help the police department get these federal grants. So eventually the entire Atlanta Narcotics Department was either fired or transferred. They did set up a civilian review board to review police actions, but within about 3 or 4 years, the police union had sort of sprung into action, defeated several of the reforms, and things were pretty much back to normal in Atlanta. Now you can argue that Atlanta was the only place where this was happening, and it happened to be the only place where they got caught. I would argue that that's fairly naive. These grants apply to, again, as I said, to every police department in the country, which means the incentives are in place for every other police department in the country. And in fact, we've seen a number of examples both before and after Katherine Johnson showing that this problem, extends to all across the country. So, as I said, the Katherine Johnson case, I think, embodies a lot of what's wrong with the way policing is done today, with militarization of police, with the way the drug war is fought. Let me give you a little history now. So there's an old Cold War quote. It's commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, although I can't find any proof that he actually said it. But it really does kind of capture a sentiment at the time that I think we've lost. The quote is, democracy means that when there's a knock on the door at 3 a.m., it's probably the milkman, right? So it's this idea that in free societies, the government doesn't send men in black with guns to your door in the middle of the night to enforce political crimes, that this isn't what we do. This is what separates us from East Germany or the former Soviet Union or North Korea. And, I would argue that not only have we gotten pretty far away from that general idea, in a good percentage of the raids today, the police don't even bother to knock anymore. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term posse comitatus. An interesting history. There are a number of things I found in researching the book that I found sort of surprising or that bucked the conventional wisdom that I was used to. So posse comitatus, again, I think what it's come to symbolize is this idea that we keep the military separate from police, right? We don't use the military for domestic policing. These are two very different institutions with two very different roles, and it becomes dangerous to conflate the two, right? The military's job is to annihilate a foreign enemy. It's to kill people and break things, basically. A police officer's job is to keep the peace, to enforce our rights. These are, again, two extremely different missions, and the fact that politicians tend to confuse the two, that they, pass these incentives for police departments to hire veterans coming back from overseas, I think betrays the misconception among a lot of politicians that they think because both jobs involve carrying a gun and using force that it must be the same thing, and obviously it isn't. There's a fascinating history behind posse comitatus, sort of the term and the law. But I will, one thing, since it's a room full of libertarians here, I do want to point out one misconception I think that a lot of people have about the Posse Comitatus Act. Posse Comitatus Act does not actually make it illegal for the president or the Congress to use the military for domestic law enforcement. What it does do, it makes it illegal for let's say a governor or a local police chief or even a federal marshal to enlist members of the active duty members of the military for a domestic police operation. But the Posse Comitatus Act very explicitly says that the president or the Congress either both still have the authority to bring the military in for some sort of domestic police action if they want to, as long as they're acting under the Constitution and under the other federal laws that govern this, the Insurrections Act and the Force Acts. So when you hear someone say that when Bush, for example, brought in federalized the National Guard and sent them to New Orleans after Katrina, that was a violation of Posse Comitatus, it actually wasn't, because the president can do that and is authorized. Now, whether he should be authorized to do that is another question. But I do think it's important that we understand the difference, so that if we want to make change and pass correct laws, we got to know what the current laws actually say. But I'm getting a little sidetracked here. I do think it's, despite the fact that that's a misconception, I think it's in some ways a healthy misconception, because I think we do have a very healthy aversion to using the military for domestic policing. I think it's something that a tradition that we've largely kept intact in this country. There are a couple notable exceptions. Reconstruction, of course, was one of them. There have been a few sort of civil uprisings, civil insurrections where the active duty military were brought in. But in all those cases, once the problem subsided, with the exception of Reconstruction, which went on for a while, but once the problem subsided, the military was sort of sent back to the military. The one period in our history where both the president and the Congress were really trying to bring the military in to do domestic policing was during the heyday of the drug war in the 1980s, when both Reagan and members of both parties of Congress wanted to bring the military in. Basically, they wanted active duty troops to start doing drug raids, to start patrolling streets, conducting drug arrests, doing searches. And I think it's a healthy sign of our democracy that the biggest opposition to this idea came from the military itself. The military sort of recognized this historic separation. I'll just give you a quote. There's the number 3 man at the Pentagon at the time was this guy, Marine Major General Thomas Olsted. And he was testifying before Congress in these hearings where they were trying to, basically they wanted to pass this law saying they're going to bring the Marines and the Army in to start doing drug raids. This was actually a proposal at one point. And here's Olsted's quote before Congress. He says, "One of America's greatest strengths is that the military is responsive to civilian authority, and that we do not allow the Army, Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force to be a police force. History is replete with countries that allowed that to happen. Disaster is the result." And it was really his testimony that knocked that idea down. But this idea of the separation goes back to the founding also, right? There's a long history of it in British common law also. If you go back to the founding, in the streets of Boston, the British had stationed active duty troops. And their job was basically to enforce the tax and import laws. So you had active duty troops patrolling the streets of Boston with these general warrants, these writs of assistance, which gave them broad powers to break into houses to search for contraband. And these warrants were so broad, if you were able to get one, it was not specific to a person or a house. Basically, if you got one, if you were an import officer or a soldier and you got one of these warrants, it said you had the authority to break into somebody's house at any time. Actually, you couldn't do it after nightfall, so even they had restrictions on that. But any time during the day to look for this contraband, and you could seize it. And the writs were active from the time they were signed until the death of the king who was in power when they were signed. So, you know, the abuse of these writs and the tension that they caused between the soldiers and Bostonians, you know, it ultimately culminated in the Boston Massacre, but this is also why we have a Fourth Amendment. I mean, it was the founders' memories of what had happened in the streets of Boston that gave us the specificity requirement of the Fourth Amendment, where it has to be specific to a certain house and a certain crime. And I think it's been with us ever since. So we've done a good job, as I said, of keeping soldiers from becoming cops or domestic police. Where we've dropped the ball, and what the book and the rest of this talk is about, is that we've allowed our police and even encouraged our police officers to become more like soldiers. And I would argue that if you give a cop a military weapon, you give him a military vehicle like a tank or an armored personnel carrier, you give him a military type uniform, and a lot of police departments are switching from the traditional police blues to what they call BDUs, or battle dress uniforms, which are modeled after the military. You give them military training, you teach them military tactics, and then you send them out in the streets and tell them they're fighting a war, whether it's a war on drugs, a war on terror, a war on crime. From the perspective of the guy carrying the gun, he's going to adopt the mentality of a soldier. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised when that happens. You're telling them over and over again that they're soldiers fighting various wars, and you're arming and dressing and training them like soldiers. They eventually are going to start acting like soldiers. So how did we get here? A little bit more history. If you go back to the mid to late 1960s, there are two trends that took off that really, I think, got us to where we are today. The first is the rise of the SWAT team, and the second is the rise of the drug war. The SWAT team you can trace back to 1965 and the Watts riots in Los Angeles. The guy who was in charge of LAPD's response to the Watts riots was Daryl Gates, who at the time was an inspector at LAPD. The Watts riots were really unlike anything we'd ever seen in this country before. They were not isolated to one part of the city, despite the name. They were sort of all over the city. Pockets would sort of flare up. There was no way to sort of contain them. And the rioters themselves, while it was clear sort of what their motivation was, I mean, these were basically racial riots. They had no list of demands. There was no precipitating, well, there was one event, the arrest of this motorist, Marcus Fry, that kind of kicked them all off, or that was kind of the fuse, but there was no sort of, you know, court ruling or specific law or policy, you know, that was their grievance. I mean, this was decades and decades of tension that had built up. Gates, like in the riots, basically took a form of urban guerrilla warfare. I mean, they had no way to respond to it. The fire department would send trucks out to go after, you know, the fires that the rioters had started, and snipers would start shooting at the firefighters. They really had no way to react. And so Gates was, you know, terrified, because, you know, this was a time in our country's history when it would be reasonable to expect this kind of civil disturbance in the future. And he thought the department had no way to react to it. So he consulted with some Marines at Camp Pendleton nearby, and he came up with this idea of putting together sort of a special forces unit for the LAPD. So you would have this team of highly trained, specialized cops who could respond to these emergency type situations. And the idea was that you would use overwhelming force and violence to diffuse an already violent situation. So the idea was you were saving lives. You would send these guys out when lives were already at risk. He first brought the idea to Chief William Parker, and I thought this was interesting. Parker actually shot him down. He rejected it. He said, this idea treads too close to this tradition we have in this country of separating the military from the police. It wasn't until Parker died a year later and the new chief took over, Chief Redden, that Gates then gets the green light, and he goes ahead with this SWAT idea. The first SWAT raid in America was in 1969. It was on a Black Panther holdout in Los Angeles. Logistically, it was kind of a nightmare. In fact, the SWAT team was lucky that all of them didn't get killed. They just had made some bad errors in judgment in how the raid went down. But from a PR standpoint, it was really an unqualified success. They exchanged thousands of rounds of gunfire in the middle of Los Angeles in a sort of a crowded residential area, but miraculously, no one was killed, and, you know, there were only a couple of Black Panthers and a couple of LAPD officers who were wounded. And across the state, it actually, you know, these guys were heroes. They had taken on this group that a lot of America was legitimately afraid of. You know, this was not the new Black Panther Party that, you know, Fox News is trying to make sound really terrifying. These guys really were. I mean, they had a count of bodies behind them. And so, you know, a lot of California especially saw this, and you know, SWAT becomes at least in California, kind of this heroic group of police officers. The next big raid comes in 1973, and this one's nationally televised. And this was against the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was an actual, domestic terrorist group. I mean, the Black Panthers had a non-violent agenda that they occasionally resorted to violence to push. The SLA was just all about violence. And the SLA had kidnapped Patty Hearst, the newspaper heiress. This was kind of like the tabloid crime story of the day. The whole country was watching what was going to happen. She was caught on surveillance video toting a machine gun during a robbery of a sporting goods store. So she claimed she had been brainwashed by this group. So everybody was following the story. So when the FBI and the LAPD say that they've isolated the SLA to this house in Los Angeles, you had national TV news crews there sort of ready to go. In fact, you can still find video of reporters sort of ducking under cars as bullets are whizzing by, reporting from the shootout. And again, this was a disaster logistically. Again, they exchanged thousands of rounds of gunfire. The SLA building ends up burning to the ground, killing everybody inside, including a number of children. But again, this was a group that everyone was afraid of. Because it was nationally televised, now it goes across the entire country. This is in 1973, where Nixon had just run 2 campaigns, sort of really exploiting fear of crime. So now SWAT gets sort of injected into the national pop culture. It becomes this huge phenomenon. 2 years later, Aaron Spelling produces a SWAT TV show, which I highly recommend if you love the sort of fast-talking, cheesy 70s cop shows. It's awesome. Milton Bradley comes out with a SWAT board game. You get SWAT lunchboxes and Viewmaster sets and jigsaw puzzles. They had these little die-cast SWAT mobiles that your son could use to, raid his sister's dollhouse. And SWAT, really, again, becomes kind of part of the pop culture. So in 1970, there was one SWAT team in the entire country in Los Angeles. By 1975, there were 500. So basically, every major city in the country has a SWAT team. So the other thing that's going on at the same time is the drug war. And Nixon really, in 1968, really plays on middle-class, basically white fear of crime in the suburbs, in the cities, black crime, basically. And, you have this kind of race-driven political campaign in 1968, making crime a central issue. And to be fair, crime was on the rise in the country at that time, and there were legitimate reasons to fear crime. One of Nixon's sort of central issues or policies that he tries to push in the 68 campaign, and that ends up getting passed in 1970, is the no-knock raid. This is another really fascinating thing I found in researching the book that I wasn't aware of. The no-knock raid was not something that police chiefs were saying they needed. It wasn't something that criminologists were saying was necessary. It was actually the brainchild of a 28-year-old Senate staffer who had been recruited to the Nixon campaign to come up with issues that Nixon could use, again, to sort of appeal to the middle class and the suburban voters. So this police tactic, this dangerous police tactic that's so ubiquitous today, is not something that sort of naturally evolved out of policing or something that police wanted. It was basically the idea of this sort of hill rat in Washington, D.C., that's what we called them when I lived there, who was asked to come up with this idea to help Nixon scare white people about black crime. In 1970, Congress passes 2 no-knock raid bills. One applies just to Washington, D.C., which Congress had jurisdiction over, and the other applies just to federal narcotics agents across the country. 2 very interesting things happened. In D.C., there was a sort of what I would consider a forward-thinking police chief named Jerry Wilson who refuses to implement the policy. He says it's too confrontational, it violates civil liberties. I actually interviewed him for the book, and he talked about how there are 2 reasons to do a no-knock raid, or 2 justifications for it that you'll often hear. One is that police should be able to break in without knocking if they think the person inside is a threat to them. And Wilson explained, and I agree with, he said, I think this makes things more dangerous for cops. Most drug dealers, don't have a death wish. They don't get into the game to kill cops. They get into the game to make money. And so when a drug dealer shoots at a cop during a drug raid, it's more likely that he thinks he's being ripped off by another drug dealer. And I interviewed actually a lot of older cops who worked in the 70s and early 80s, who said, we served search warrants. One guy who was undercover at the Hells Angels investigating their meth trade in San Jose, California. And when he was ready to do the raid, he said he and 3 uniformed cops walked up to the front door, knocked on the front door, said, please, search warrant. Within about 10 seconds, they opened the door, let them in, they searched the place, found lots of evidence of meth, and made their prosecutions. I mean, the idea that every criminal wants to kill a bunch of cops is ridiculous. I mean, criminals know if you kill a cop, you're going to be lucky to survive the next 4 or 5 seconds. And if you survive that, you're probably going to go to prison for the rest of your life or be executed if you're in a death penalty state. The other thing Wilson said is, the other justification is police should be able to break in if they think knocking and announcing will give the person time to dispose of evidence, which would be drug evidence. And the really perverse thing about this is, one, it's basically saying we should be able to violate the castle doctrine and visit terror upon you in order to preserve a conviction for a nonviolent consensual crime, right? That's the first thing it says. Second thing it says is that, it also assumes you're guilty, right? It says we should be able to do this because if we have a warrant, that means you're probably guilty. But the other thing is that, if you think about it, it actually gives more protection to people who are major drug dealers than people who are low-level drug dealers. Because if you have a very small supply of pot or cocaine in your house, it's very easy for you to dispose of it quickly by flushing it. If you have a huge supply, you can't dispose of it. And so if the argument is we should be able to break in if we can show that they're likely to dispose of the evidence, that's actually giving more protection to the kingpins than it is to the low-level drug dealers. So Jerry Wilson refuses to implement the policy. And interestingly, crime goes down in D.C. over the next 3 years as it goes up in the rest of the country. Across the country, Nixon's narcotics agents, a whole different story. They go crazy with this bill. You've got these undercover cops. These aren't SWAT teams. These are guys in street clothes, kicking down doors left and right all over the country, raiding places without warrants, terrorizing families, just needlessly being violent. One story, they broke into this guy's house. The door was unlocked and open, but they still smashed out all the windows and took a battering ram to the door just to damage the door. The New York Times does an investigation, the AP does an investigation. They find hundreds of stories of people who've been wrongly raided. And then a really interesting thing happens. Congress holds hearings. They bring the victims forward to testify. And Congress inexplicably shows some shame and remorse and reflection, and they actually repeal both of these laws, which I didn't know was possible. But the no-knock raid would return in the 80s, of course, with a vengeance, and we've got all sorts of collateral damage since, and nobody in Congress really cares. But there was a time when at least a few people did. So throughout the 70s, these two trends sort of move parallel to one another, side by side. But SWAT teams are mostly reserved, again, for these emergency-type situations. If you think bank robberies or an escaped fugitive or a barricade. Situations where, again, you're using violence to diffuse an already violent situation. And you're sending them after somebody who is in the process of committing a crime. It's in the 80s where the two trends converge because of a number of policies, and it's really in the 80s that we start to see SWAT teams used primarily to serve search warrants on people suspected of drug crimes. And the difference here is really important, I think. I mean, now, instead of using violence to diffuse an already violent situation, you're now creating violence and confrontation where there was none before. Instead of using this kind of force against somebody who is in the process of committing a violent crime in order to save lives, you're using against people who are still just suspects of nonviolent consensual crimes, and you're actually putting lives at risk. You're actually, breaking into homes in the middle of the night elicits a very primal response in people. And there's a very low margin for error in these cases on both sides, police and the people being raided. And if anything goes wrong, people are going to die, and of course they have, and will continue to. So again, it's really during the Reagan administration that we see this stuff take off, and there are a number of reasons for it. The first thing Reagan does is he directs the Pentagon to start sharing surplus military equipment with police departments across the country. So we start to see tanks, armored personnel carriers, helicopters, machine guns, bayonets for some strange reason. Police departments love bayonets. Start being transferred from police departments or from the Pentagon to police departments across the country. And this program has just been expanded since, and in 1997 it was finally formalized with its own bureaucracy. There's an office in, I believe in Virginia, and then another one in Kalamazoo, Michigan, just in a master's district, by the way. So we see millions of pieces of military equipment have been transferred from the Pentagon to police departments across the country, literally millions. And again, we're talking, some of it's office supplies and sort of mundane things, but most of it, again, are these tanks and helicopters. Boone County, Indiana, which is, does not have any shoreline or major lakes or rivers, got an amphibious armored personnel carrier through the program. There's a sheriff in Florida, a rural county, who basically assembled his own Air Force through the program. And again, there's no sort of rhyme or reason. It's whichever police departments are best at sort of adjusting to the system and getting on quickly to get the stuff before somebody else takes it. In Los Angeles County, the Sheriff's Department actually they have two 18-wheelers on standby, 24-hour standby. So as soon as a cool new piece of equipment becomes available, they can send them, because the police department has to pay for shipping. They have to get the stuff to the department on their own, but everything else is free. So the quicker you can get there, the more cool stuff you can get. Another thing Reagan does is he starts these anti-drug grants that I talked about in the Katherine Johnston case, and these are federal grants that are just for drug policing. So if you think about it, you're a police department chief or you're a sheriff, you've just got all this cool heavy-duty equipment from the Pentagon, so you start a SWAT team because why not? And now you can keep your SWAT team in mothballs and wait for a hostage taking or a bank robbery in Bolingbrook or my hometown of Greenfield, Indiana. Or you can start sending your SWAT team out on drug raids and actually generating revenue for your police department through these anti-drug grants. And you throw in asset forfeiture policies, which are another way to generate revenue for these raids, and now there's a strong incentive to start sending your SWAT team out for these raids. We correspondingly see an explosion in both the number and frequency of use of SWAT teams. There's a criminologist in Eastern Kentucky, Peter Kraska, who in the late 90s sent surveys out to police departments across the country, and then did a follow-up in 2005, and he asked them to go back to the late 70s and tell him when they started their SWAT team and then how many times they deployed their SWAT team each year. Here's what he found. In the late 70s, there were 200 to 300 SWAT raids per year across the entire country, so 200 to 300. By the early 80s, we're looking at about 3,000 per year, and by 2005, when he did his follow-up study, we were looking at 50,000 SWAT raids per year. So from a few hundred in the late 70s to 50,000 by 2005, basically most of my life in that period, we see a 1,500% increase in the use of SWAT teams. I'll give you another statistic. In 1981, if you look at towns between 25,000 and 50,000 people, 13% of them had a SWAT team in 1981. By 2000, 80% of towns between 25,000 and 50 had a SWAT team. And today, it's just about all of them do, because the trends that have been driving this have only continued. The other thing you really see from the Reagan administration is a ramping up of the rhetoric, the martial rhetoric, the war rhetoric. Reagan at one point declares drugs a threat to U.S. national security. He compares one of my favorite analogies is he compared the drug war to the World War I Battle of Verdun. So if you know your European history, Verdun was this battle which is sort of notorious in Europe of these two armies sort of exchanging fire in the trenches for months and months and months on end. I think there were 750,000 casualties. And it was over this strip of land that had no strategic value whatsoever. And it basically just became national pride and sort of symbolism to win this battle, which I think the metaphor was probably a lot more appropriate than Reagan realized when he made it. But Bill Bennett was Reagan's education secretary. He later becomes our first official drug czar. Bennett, at one point on Larry King Live, suggested the idea of beheading drug dealers on television. At another point, also on Larry King, he says, and I'll use the scare quotes that he used, it's a funny sort of war when the enemy gets habeas corpus. So basically suggesting we suspend habeas corpus for people accused of drug crimes. Daryl Gates himself becomes a champion of the drug war. At one point, Gates says drug users, not dealers even, drug users are guilty of treason and they should be taken out in the street and shot. This is a position he would later walk back when his son was caught with drugs. Twice, actually. But you see this rhetoric coming from the politicians, and then it filters down to the police chiefs, to the sheriffs, and I've got a lot of quotes in the book from politicians saying particularly stupid things about comparing drugs to actual combat. You may have heard Michael Bloomberg 3 years ago referred to NYPD as the 7th largest army in the world. I'll give you another quote. This is from a sheriff. This is about 3 years ago in Clayton County, Georgia. He says, "The war on drugs in Clayton County, as in most jurisdictions, I liken it to the Vietnam War. Hit and miss. There's no clear win. We don't know if we're gaining ground or not. What we want to do is change our strategy. We want to make this more like a Normandy invasion." Right? So this guy's saying not only do we need to fight the drug war as an actual war, but it needs to be, a real war, not a namby-pamby war like Vietnam. And you got to, remember, this guy's talking about about his own constituents, right? These are the people who voted for him, who elected him, saying we need to treat them as if they are soldiers and we are storming German soldiers and we're storming the beaches of Normandy. Now you can imagine what effect that has on his deputies, how they approach their jobs. You know, one of the criticisms I've gotten from police groups for the book is that I'm exaggerating this, and I'm exaggerating the mindset problem that cops approach their jobs as if they're soldiers. There's a website called Police One. It's kind of the main hub of police activity on the internet. And they actually published a series of essays in response to my book, which I guess is flattering in its own weird way. But one of the essays was written by this SWAT commander in Sterling Heights, Michigan, and he doesn't say that I'm exaggerating the mindset problem. He basically says, of course I see myself as a soldier and my neighborhood as a battlefield. That's how I'm supposed to see it. And in this essay, he actually says that being a cop today is as dangerous as being an active duty soldier in Afghanistan, which is absolutely preposterous. I mean, the numbers aren't even close. And in fact, last year was the safest year for police officers since the early 1960s. In fact, you are more likely to be murdered just living in a city like Chicago, Nashville, Atlanta, than you are to be murdered while working as a police officer. So, you know, the job is more dangerous than journalists, for example. But the idea that, you know, we need to suspend our civil liberties and sort of give up the Fourth Amendment in order to protect police officers because it's such a dangerous job just isn't borne out by the statistics. I'll give you one more quick anecdote because this is one of my favorites. There's a sheriff in Richland County, South Carolina, Sheriff Leon Lott, who got a tank through the Pentagon program. Not just any tank, it has a gun turret that rotates 360 degrees and shoots, it's a machine gun that shoots belt-fed 50 caliber ammunition. Now the military has restrictions on 50 caliber ammunition. You know, a 50 cal bullet will go through, you know, 10 city blocks pretty much no matter what's standing in the way. The idea that this is appropriate for domestic policing, much less policing in an urban environment or, you know, a county that includes the University of South Carolina, is absolutely absurd. When Lott got his tank from the Pentagon, he put out a press release. There's a photo at the top where he's posing with his tank along with the SWAT team. And at the top of it, he had nicknamed his tank the Peacemaker. And he included the Bible verse at the top, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." Now, to give you an idea of in what sort of situation Sheriff Lott finds this use of force appropriate, you may remember a few years ago when the Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps was photographed smoking pot at a University of South Carolina party. This was in Sheriff Lott's jurisdiction. He took personal offense to this and was determined to get to the bottom of whoever supplied the pot that was being smoked in that photo. And so there's actually a lawsuit now pending against Sheriff Lott, brought by the people whose only crime was to have appeared in that photo in the background. And the description is so surreal. Basically, these people were woken up to the sound of SWAT teams breaking into their home, flash grenades going off, they're pulled out of their beds, thrown to the floor, guns put to their heads, and the cops were screaming not "where are the guns, where are the drugs," but "what do you know about Michael Phelps?" Which is just amusing and sort of terrifying at the same time. One more, because this one's great too. You all know Steven Seagal, I'm sure, the action movie star. So Seagal was deputized a few years ago by a sheriff's department in Louisiana for the reality show Steven Seagal Lawman, where a couple of cameras followed him around. He had to resign that position after some unfortunate sexual harassment allegations, but he was then deputized by Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the self-proclaimed toughest sheriff in America. And Arpaio has his own tank that he got through the Pentagon. And with the reality cameras in tow, he sent Seagal out on a raid against a guy suspected of cockfighting, so raising chickens to fight one another. And for this crime, they broke out the tank, and Seagal was driving the tank, and he drove the tank into the guy's living room in order to enforce the search warrant to search for cockfighting cocks. Well, if they have razors on their feet, of course, yeah. They end up killing all the chickens and also shooting both of the guy's dogs. When Seagal was asked why that kind of force was necessary for a suspected cockfighter, he responded that he's an animal lover. So, We're also seeing increasingly, and this just happened this last week, I know Ohio State University got its own MRAP, which is a armored personnel carrier that's capable of withstanding a hit from a landmine. Ohio State University, by the way, that's, if you didn't catch the beginning of that, got its own MRAP. And this is what we're increasingly seeing now, campus SWAT teams. There's one just started last year that I wrote about at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And the justification for this is always Virginia Tech, Columbine, right? The reality is, and there's a sociologist at the University of Virginia who's crunched the numbers, the average middle school, high school, or college campus can expect to see a homicide about once every 6,000 or 7,000 years. That's one homicide, not a mass shooting. So the idea that you need a SWAT team on campus to guard against another Virginia Tech is, preposterous. However, once the SWAT team's up and in place, there's more than enough, drug activity to keep them busy once they're going. But this is always the case. It's always, we need it because of Columbine, we need it because of Virginia Tech. How was it used 2 years later? Well, we mostly used them to serve drug warrants. And there have been people shot. There was at Grand Valley State University 2 years ago, this kid, Derek Kopp, was shot. The SWAT team, his roommate had sold somebody pot. The SWAT team raids the place. They raid by taking a hammer to the glass patio door and shattering it. He wakes up, grabs a flashlight to see what's going on. One of the officers mistakes that for a gun and shoots him in the chest. He actually lived, but in the lawsuit, the police union attorney said that Kopp was to blame, Derek Kopp, the student, was to blame because he acted suspiciously when someone shattered the glass to his patio door and came into his house. So there are two kind of big milestones that I want to talk about real quickly, where we enter, I would say, frightening new territory. The first comes in 1996 when California legalizes medical marijuana. And up until this point, the justification for this kind of force from police and government agencies was always that, the threat we're facing from drug dealers is so great that they're heavily armed and they're dangerous people, they're career criminals. We need to use this kind of force in response to the threat that we're facing. And there were rebuttals to all those arguments, right? But at least they were making the argument that this kind of force was proportional to the threat. What happens after California legalizes medical marijuana and several states follow suit is the Clinton administration responds by sending federal SWAT teams in to raid these medical marijuana dispensaries, treatment centers, and grows. Now, at this point, you can't make this argument anymore, right? I mean, these are businesses. They're operating openly under state law. They have business licenses. These aren't underground criminal enterprises. The mom and pop couple the hippie couple that are running the pot shop are not going to pull out an AR-15 from under the counter and kill a bunch of federal agents. At this point, you're using violence to make a political statement. The federal government was not happy that these states were legalizing medical marijuana and were openly flouting federal law. So they were sending SWAT teams in, basically, to bring the boot down on these people to make an example of them and to send a message. And, I don't think this was fully appreciated at the time. I mean, a lot of people were protesting the raids, but I don't think people fully appreciated what was going on, that this was government, again, using violence for a political purpose. And this is not, something we normally associate with free societies. And, of course, it's been continuing ever since. Not only that, there have actually been more medical marijuana raids under Obama in 4 years than there were in Bush under 8. So things are actually getting worse. You also see this, you've probably read about the SWAT raids on co-ops and Amish farms that are selling unpasteurized milk products to people. Again, your average Amish farm is not a threat to kill a bunch of federal agents. But again, they're openly flouting the FDA. In some cases they've been warned a couple times, and so you have to make an example of them, and you do that by using violence. The other new point where we enter new territory is really in the last probably 6 or 7 years, I've noticed since I've been writing on this issue, and that's that SWAT teams are now getting a case of mission creep, and they're finding new ways to justify their existence. So you might remember in the mid-2000s, the Texas Hold'em poker craze starts taking off. We see local governments across the country responding by sending in SWAT teams to raid these neighborhood poker games. And again, not an appropriate use of force. I mean, we're talking $20 buy-ins, $50 buy-ins. In most states, poker is legal unless the house takes a rake. There was a case in California where they raided a bunch of games that were $20 buy-ins. The house was not taking a rake, but the people who were running the game took $5 from everyone to buy beer and chips and refreshments, and the police said that was a rake, therefore we're going to send the SWAT team. There was a VFW post in Dallas that was holding charity poker games every Friday night to help veterans with their medical bills. Apparently they were doing it in a way that wasn't compliant with Texas gambling law. So instead of sending a couple of bureaucrats with clipboards to tell them how to do it right, they instead sent a SWAT team to raid the entire place, scare the hell out of these elderly people. A couple of them urinated on themselves. They did enough damage that they couldn't repay the landlord. The VFW ended up getting evicted. No more poker games, I guess. So they had protected Texas from the scourge of VFW poker games. But we're also seeing SWAT teams. How much time do I have? Can I? All right. Can I get like maybe 5 more minutes? Then I'll take questions. All right. So I got to wrap up. I could talk more and more, but that's why you should buy the book, right? But so we're now even seeing SWAT teams used in regulatory law. I've written about SWAT teams that have been sent to bars and frat parties where police thought there was underage drinking going on. There were a bunch of SWAT raids in Orlando 3 years ago that were basically licensure inspections. They had sent somebody from the state's occupational licensing board to make sure all the barbers who were cutting hair were properly licensed. And of course, the obvious way to do that is with the SWAT team. But also, I talk about protest and the response to protest. It's getting increasingly to the point where the only response we have to protest now is to send cops out in full RoboCop gear, expecting confrontation. Of course, when you send cops out expecting confrontation, you end up getting it. Just to give you an example, the mentality with which police are responding to protests, at the DNC in 2008 in Denver, the Denver Police Union was selling T-shirts. They had printed up and were selling T-shirts, both to union and non-union members. The image was of a Denver cop with a baton overlooking the Denver skyline with a menacing look on his face, and the logo on the T-shirt says, Denver Police, 2008 DNC, we get up early to beat the crowds. This is, it's one thing for cops to make those kind of jokes amongst themselves, but they were actually projecting this image to the public and saw nothing wrong with it. I'm going to close with one more anecdote, the story of Corey May, because I really think it kind of illustrates just how far we've come on this issue. So Corey May was, at the time, he was 21 years old. He was home with his 18-month-old daughter the day after Christmas 2001. He and his girlfriend had just moved in together about 2 weeks earlier to sort of start a life together with their kid. She was working she had the night shift at a chicken processing factory, so he was home alone with the kid. They lived in a duplex. The guy on the other side of the duplex was a guy named Jamie Smith, who actually already had drug charges pending against him and was kind of a known drug dealer in the area. So it appears by all intents and purposes the police were after Jamie Smith. Neither Corey nor his girlfriend's name appear anywhere on the search warrant. Jamie Smith's does. So apparently Officer Ron Jones gets a tip from this informant that there's drug activity going on in the duplex on Mary Street. Now, we later found out that the informant, who Jones described as trustworthy and reliable and who had been used in countless other drug raids in the area, was this guy Randy Gentry, who was a drug addict himself and also a unapologetic racist. When he found out that Corey's lawyers had figured out who he was, he left this long message on one of the answering machines of the attorneys, which I have the recording. I think it's a minute long, and I think we counted like 14 N-bombs in 1 minute during the message. And this was a guy that police described as trustworthy and reliable, who they were using to raid the homes of black people across the area. So Corey wakes up at 12:30 in the morning to the sound of armed men breaking into his house. By the way, they raided Jamie Smith's side of the duplex first. Jamie Smith opened the door, let him in, and was arrested without incident, which, if you're a drug dealer and somebody's pounding on your door in the middle of the night, you have good reason to think it's probably the police, right? Corey was not a drug dealer. He had no prior criminal record. He occasionally smoked pot. They found a roach in his apartment, which would have gotten him a $50 fine under any other circumstances. But he wakes up to the sound of armed men trying to break into his house. He goes to the bedroom with his daughter, pulls a legal gun out of his nightstand, holds it to his chest, lays down on the floor next to the daughter, sort of hoping the noises will go away. They don't. They move around to the back. The door flies open. A figure in black sends this 3-step climb into Corey's apartment. Corey fires his gun 3 times, hits Officer Ron Jones. Jones was wearing a bulletproof vest, but one of the bullets got up under the vest, pierced his abdomen, and he bled out and died on the way to the hospital. Corey was arrested. Actually, he was severely beaten, then arrested, and charged with capital murder, the knowing intentional killing of a police officer. Now, the state's theory, There are two theories here, right? The state's theory is that Corey woke up to noises, looked out the window, saw an armed team of police officers about to raid his apartment, decided he was going to take them on despite that he had no criminal record and nothing illegal really to speak of in the house. Decided he was going to take them on with his handgun, waited for them to break in, shot and killed just one of the officers, and then surrendered with bullets still left in the gun. Right? That's the state's theory. Corey's theory was he woke up to armed people breaking into his house, thought they were there to do him harm, shot when the door flew open, and then surrendered with bullets still left in the gun as soon as he realized they were police. I found the case when I was researching a paper I wrote on this stuff for Cato in 2006, and it immediately sort of leaped off the screen at me as something's terribly wrong here. People with no criminal record and who aren't committing any crimes don't normally intentionally kill police officers and then immediately surrender to them. So Corey gets convicted in 2004 and sentenced to death. So he's on death row when I find his case. He was, the cards were stacked against him. He was black, the cop was white. This isn't a part of Jefferson Davis County, Mississippi, where race is still a pretty suffocating part of everyday life. He also happened to have killed the son of the town police chief. And to make matters worse, actually, Ron Jones, this is, race relations are pretty bad in this part of Mississippi, but this was one of the few white cops that black people in the area really loved. I mean, this guy he was a fair cop. He was pretty loved by everyone. And so it makes it, particularly, not that even killing a bad cop would have been a good thing, but it makes it particularly tragic that, he killed one of the cops who everybody liked. So I find the case. I started writing about it on the blog, kind of picked up some momentum in the blogosphere. There was an associate at Covington & Burling, the big firm in D.C., read about it on, actually, I think it was on National Review Online. Has a daughter the same age as Corey's, brought the firm on board and to represent Corey pro bono, hired their own investigators. And I won't take you through all the procedural history, but basically the death sentence gets thrown out. Corey gets resentenced to life without parole. He then, 3 years ago, the Mississippi Supreme Court gives him a new trial. At his regular trial, he was not allowed to argue that he was defending his daughter's life that night. Mississippi Supreme Court says he should have been. They give him a new trial. The trial was actually also held, the alleged crime was committed in Jefferson Davis County, which was about 70% black. The trial, he had a really terrible attorney who I think had watched too many cop shows. Immediately wanted to change the venue, and I don't think she realized what she was doing. So she actually moved the venue from a county that was 70% black to a county that was 85% white. And state Supreme Court also ruled that if he gets a new trial, it should be in the county where the alleged crime actually happened. So I think at that point the prosecutors realized that, at best they were going to get a hung jury. So in 2011, they offered him a deal where they would let him plead to felony manslaughter and give him time served, which means he would get out of prison immediately. By that point, he had been in prison for 10 years. He had 4 on death row, 6 in Parchment Penitentiary in Unit 19, which is one of the most notoriously violent prison units in the country. He had been away from his kids for 10 years. This guy was, by all counts, a doting, loving father. This is part of the country where not too many kids don't have a good father figure, and Corey certainly was. They had used a corrupt medical examiner to help convict him, which I wrote gave me a bunch more articles to write about this particular medical examiner. But anyway, so he gets home. He goes home to his kids, and a couple weeks later, I'm at the homecoming party that they throw for him, and it's this joyous occasion. There's this huge buffet, soul food buffet, and Corey's taking kids out for rides on a four-wheeler, and he's reconnecting, rebonding with his daughter and his son, and everybody's happy and joyous. And of course, there's good reason to. He's out of prison. He's back having a life again. He's been doing great ever since. But then I was also talking to his attorney toward the end of the evening, and it kind of struck us how perverse it was that we were all happy about this, right? I mean, in a just society, this guy had been doing nothing wrong. The police broke into his house in the middle of the night, put him in peril, put his daughter in peril, put him in this horrible position of having to choose whether or not to kill the people breaking into his home. He made an honest mistake, which lots of police officers have made during these raids and are never held accountable for. And for that, the state tried to kill him. They took him out of his kids' lives for 10 years. His girlfriend moved on, got married. He was put in a nasty, nasty prison, where people are killed pretty much weekly. And at the end of all this, the state generously let him plead guilty to a felony in order to get out, which of course is going to follow him around for the rest of his life. Every time he applies for a job, he can never own a gun, he can never vote. And this is one of the happy stories, right? This is one of the happy endings. This is one, where we were saying, this is the one we point to say, well, at least some good can come out of some of these cases. And it made me sort of realize just how far I think we've come. That where a story like that, we should all be protesting outside of a courthouse in Mississippi somewhere about what happened to this guy. And instead, it's one we cite as a good story. When Ken introduced me, he used the term police state, and I think that term is a little bit overused sometimes. I mean, I think if we lived in a genuine police state, I'd have been arrested for writing this book, and you'd all probably be arrested for being here listening to me talk. But for people like Katherine Johnston and Corey May and some of the other people I've written about in this book, for black people in most parts of New York City, it is a police state. I mean, their interaction with police officers was everything. It was all-encompassing. It either ended their lives or it dramatically altered them. And despite the fact that they had done nothing wrong, the word of the state, the word of the people working for the state, took precedence over any sort of sense of justice or any, numerous witnesses. They were overruled by these. For those of us who are unlucky enough to have an interaction like this with a police officer, it does very quickly become a police state. And as for the broader police state, of course, we may not live in one now, but it's a huge mistake to wait until we get there to try to complain. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Radley, for an excellent presentation. We have time for maybe 10 minutes of questions. You actually answered my first question pretty much, except I would point out that there are people who write books on income tax resistance who have been enjoined from publishing. There have been people in the healthcare field who have been enjoined from doing the same. So maybe not in quantity, but in quality, I think, my opinion, we're there.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to point out from your introduction, because I think it's fascinating, the Department of Education. So I wrote about, when a book came out, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that went with the book that talked about that raid, the Department of Education raid. What was interesting is it was initially reported that this guy was raided because his wife was behind on her student loans. And the Department of Education issued this very sort of offended press release saying, of course that's not what happened. We raided this woman, or what they thought was this woman, because she had lied on her student loan applications and was defrauding the student loan program, as if, okay, that makes it all right. And then, of course, the question is, why does the Department of Education have a SWAT team in the first place? And they also sent the Wall Street Journal a demand for a correction, which, to my chagrin, the editors actually gave them. But the Department of Education said they don't have a SWAT team. They said, we do have a team of armed police officers that serve high-risk warrants with shotguns, battering rams, and body armor, but they don't get tactical training, therefore they're not a SWAT team. So basically they're saying we have a police team that does everything a SWAT team does, they're just not as well trained, therefore we're offended that you would call them a SWAT team. I mean, the thinking behind that blows my mind.
Feedback by the speaker, so here you
go. Hi. Last summer I had the most amazing experience. I went down to Tampa for the Republican convention. I think it was last summer. And there's these huge troops of brown uniformed guys marching around the city. And they clearly weren't stormtroopers. They were, at one point a bunch of them marched by me and I said, where are you guys from? And all these smiling faces turned towards me and said, and they're different towns from around the country they were from, And so, what in the world was going on there? Who would bring these guys in from all over the country to march them around Tampa in brown uniforms?
Well, this is, as I said, I mean, this is our standard response to protest now, is this overwhelming police presence. And by the way, the image on the cover of the book, that's from the Tampa.
Oh, okay.
It's the RNC was in Tampa last time, right? Yeah. So yeah, this is the way it's done. And I wrote a piece a while back about the G20 summit in Pittsburgh a few years ago. And this is, I mean, it's not just that the town like Tampa or Pittsburgh responds with an overwhelming police presence. They actually hire freelancing police officers from across the country, and they get overtime to come to these cities to help provide security. In fact, you may remember from Pittsburgh there was this a couple amazing stories. One with this guy sort of walking alongside the road, and this black van pulls up, and a bunch of men in black take the guy off the street and throw him in the van, and he drives off. And it looked like sort of disappearance you read about in Latin America in the 70s. But it was a police team in Chicago that had been hired to come down, given overtime to come down and provide security at this event. There's another one where there's a police team, another one from Chicago, all dressed in all camouflage, who had arrested this protester and then forced him to pose with them for a trophy photo that they could take back to Chicago and put on their wall. Also, the camouflage always gets me. I mean, there's no reason for cops to wear camouflage other than to mimic the military, right? I mean, one, you're not trying to hide from anything in these raids. And two, if you were, you're not raiding forests, right? You're raiding houses and buildings. So yeah, I mean, the only reason to be wearing camouflage is, again, to sort of project a military presence.
I'm sorry, I got back from lunch a little bit late, so if you've already covered this, just let me know. But do you mention anything in your book about free speech zones and how they're enforcing that?
Yeah, I've not covered that. That's in the book. But yeah, well, actually, the free speech zones themselves are in the book, but I think it goes with the response to protest. And I mean, this is the really perverse thing about how we respond to protest today is that really the more important the event, the more influential the decision makers, the more consequential the decisions they're making at the event, the less likely it is the protesters are going to be allowed anywhere near them to influence their decisions. And that's, the exact opposite of what the First Amendment is supposed to be about. But I will say, it's not completely related to the protest. Campus free speech zones, which are, I mean, it's not really related to the topic today, but there was a case just at a community college in, I think it was in California, where a Students for Liberty student was arrested for handing out constitutions on Constitution Day. And the FIRE, which is a great organization that sticks up for students in these circumstances, posted a map of the campus and where the free speech zone was. And I mean, literally, if you have a piece of paper, that would be the entire campus. I mean, the free speech zone was about the size of like half your fingernail. I mean, that's where you're allowed to have free speech on that campus. And we see that at campuses all over the country. But go to thefire.org. They have lots of great information on that stuff that'll blow your mind and raise your blood pressure.
I used to do a lot of petition balloting to get the Libertarian candidates on the ballot at the Miller Park, which is a publicly financed ballpark there in the Milwaukee area, and it was a tremendous place to do petitioning until the Republicans and Democrats realized that the Libertarians were getting too many ballots, so they decided to enforce this free speech zone to regulate us to a small area where we could collect no signatures.
I mean, yeah, I mean, just think about that, how absurd that is, that there are the government is saying there are zones where you're allowed to speak freely now, and they get to determine where the zones, I mean, it's just, the fact that we're allowing this to happen is tragedy.
You touched base on mission creep, and definitely where that would take place. Partly, and I don't know, maybe you saw this too in talking to chiefs or sheriffs, that it may be done because if they don't use it in a situation, they have got this asset available, and they don't use it, then an officer is injured, it would come back on them as administrators. Did you find that at all? And then as a follow-up question, what is your solution, or what have you found to wind that back down? Is it the sheriffs? Is it going to be the police chiefs? Is it going to be legislation, regulation? How do you wind this back so it has a good purpose, but it has to have limits on it?
Yeah, I mean, you do hear the argument all the time. I mean, officer safety trumps everything now. I mean, I've written a lot about this weird phenomenon of police killing dogs, and cases where, I mean, it's just absurd. Like, they'll get called to your house because your burglar alarm accidentally went off, and while they're there, your dog will growl at a cop and he'll shoot and kill it. And the justification is always, all the cop has to say, it's a subjective test. The cop has to say, I felt in fear for my safety. That's all they need to say. And it's this officer safety, this idea that the threat of a small break in the skin from a dog's tooth, and that allows a cop to fill your dog full of bullets. And it's not even an objective threat. It's whether just he feels threatened. He could just have an irrational fear of dogs. I'm getting off the track because I like dogs. But I think it goes back to this. I mean, you hear this all the time. Officer safety should trump everything. And so police chiefs and sheriffs will say, I want to do everything to protect my officers. Now, I would argue that these raids make things more dangerous for cops. I mean, Matthew David Stewart in Utah was a guy who, a former veteran who had 12 pot plants in his basement, and a bitter ex-girlfriend gave him up to the cops. I'm not making that up. And they raided the place in the middle of the night, and he shot and killed one cop and wounded 6. He got wounded. They charged him with capital murder. He ended up hanging himself in his jail cell over, a few pot plants in his basement. I would argue in the search warrant they said they knew that he worked at Walmart. Why don't you pick him up when he's coming or going to his job, right? Why do you have to use a battering ram in the middle of the night and come in with your guns, making it more dangerous for everyone? I mean, if they'd done that, that cop would still be alive today, and so the other 5 wouldn't be injured, and Matthew Stewart would probably, have paid a $500 fine, and that's it. Yeah, well, it's Utah. I probably would have gotten more than that. But yeah, I mean, I would argue this makes things more dangerous. But how you convince them of that, that's the problem. But when they do have to confront actually dangerous people, they do find ways to do it nonviolently. If you remember Whitey Bulger, when they confronted him a couple years ago, this is a guy who had 19 homicides to his name, had a small arsenal of weapons, was aging, sick. Like, if ever there was a candidate to go out in a blaze of glory and kill a bunch of cops, it would be Whitey Bulger. And how did they confront him? Well, they found him. They did their research. They learned that he was renting a storage locker. They called him up, had somebody from the company call him up and say, someone had broken into the storage locker. We need you to come down and sign some papers. He shows up to sign the papers. They arrest him without incident. So when they have to confront somebody who actually is dangerous, they'll do their homework and they'll do their research and find a nonviolent way to arrest them. Problem is, there's so many damn drug warrants that they're serving today. They just don't have the time or the manpower to get creative about it, and so it's easier just to use overwhelming force all the time. And I think that is really a huge part of the problem. As for how we roll it back, I mean, there's a whole chapter in the book on that. I think just strategically, I think a couple things. I think you have to target the politicians, because I say this over and over again in the book. It's not an anti-cop book. We can sit here and rail all day about how terrible cops are, that they're, throw all this invective at them. It's not going to change anything. You have a bad system that's loaded with bad incentives. You can feed the best people in the world into that system, and you're going to keep getting bad results until you change the policies. So it's really the politicians that have to be targeted. And the politicians, politicians are they're cowards. I mean, they're very risk averse. They've been raised for the last 40 years to understand that the only acceptable position on crime is that we need to get tougher on it. I think public opinion is moving in the right direction on this issue. I think people are, as they see how this stuff is actually being done, they're increasingly outraged by it. But I do think it's not enough just to give politicians political cover to do the right thing. I think it actually has to be a liability for them not to do the right thing. So I mean, I think it has to get to the point where people are voting on these issues, where you have super PACs that are, targeting sheriffs and police chiefs and mayors and judges who, support and endorse and expand these policies, so where they have to think twice about it. They have to think, maybe this is going to hurt me personally or hurt my career personally if I don't do the right thing here. So I mean, there's a lot of more specific strategies and reform proposals and policies in the book, but I think in terms of just general strategy, I think you have to take aim at the that's a bad way of putting it. You have to make the politicians. It has to be a liability for them not to do the right thing, and at all levels. I mean, Congress, mayor. You need to get involved in like your local district attorney races. I mean, prosecutors do so much damage, and they're reelected at like a 90-95% clip. Getting your, sheriffs are important. Police chiefs aren't elected, unfortunately, but yeah, I think the political side is where to go.
Radley, Balko, thank you so much.